Thank you to everyone that's tuned in for today's event, New York's Student Debt Crisis, how policymakers and advocates are partnering to protect borrowers. We have a great event lined up with a lot of great speakers and leaders who are fighting to protect borrowers in New York. I want to begin by introducing Seth Frotman, the Executive Director of the Student Borrower Protection Center, who will provide welcoming remarks. Seth?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Normally, I like to open these events by reminding folks of the sheer size of the student debt crisis. Numbers like $1.7 trillion in outstanding student loan debt nationwide, or $100 billion in student debt across the state of New York. But most of you already know these numbers because you live with the reality of this debt burden every single day. Instead, I think the more telling story is that amid a global pandemic, on the front page of the New York Times today was a story about student debt, because student debt is everywhere, casting a shadow over everything borrowers do, every decision they make. Borrowers who have been denied access to the American dream because of the weight of debt-fueled higher education, combined with predatory and exploitative market practices that are like tinder on the flames of this crisis. The unscrupulous companies that plague this market have seized this moment in time, a pandemic that has brought on unprecedented unemployment and financial instability, as an opportunity to make a quick buck. In fact, in our report released today, we found that some of the communities hardest hit by COVID, including Kings, Queens, and the Bronx, are the same communities being targeted by dubious lawsuits pursuing unsubstantiated student debt. The day the courthouses opened back up last summer, these companies were lined up ready to strike. Not surprisingly, these communities also happen to be majority-minority communities. Another reminder that the predatory and discriminatory tactics used across the student loan industry only serve to exacerbate the racial wealth gap and perpetuate vicious cycles of inequality. Which is why our conversation today is so important. The status quo is broken. We can no longer allow student loan companies to run roughshod over borrowers. We can no longer ignore the role student debt plays in denying equity and equality for communities of color. We must demand better, and fortunately, we have the right people for the job. On behalf of our esteemed partners, Community Service Society of New York, Young Invincibles, and all of the amazing organizations that comprise New Yorkers for Responsible Lending, I'm honored to be joined today by our great panelists. These folks have been tirelessly fighting to strengthen protections for student loan borrowers and hold predatory actors to account, whether it's in the State House in Albany, courthouses in Rochester, or across the boroughs of New York City. During the first panel, you'll hear from some of the legislators leading the most aggressive package of student loan legislation in the country, pulling from their advocacy and public service roots to make sure the voices of borrowers is represented in Albany. Before Kevin Thomas became Senator Thomas, he was a legal aid attorney fighting against predatory for-profit schools ripping off students throughout the Bronx. And now he's fighting to outlaw these practices statewide. Assemblymember Harvey Epstein, decade of public service, both as a community legal aid attorney and now as an elected leader, have been fueled by seeing those who have been systemically disenfranchised by a broken system and fighting for change. First in housing rights, then immigrant rights, and now student loan borrowers' rights. Assemblymember Ken Zabrowski has dedicated his career to crafting policies that improve the lives of every New Yorker, from early childhood education to expanding access to healthcare to improved infrastructure safety. And he's taken on the same fight on behalf of student loan borrowers to expand protections at every stage of repayment. In 2019, he and Senator Thomas led New York's landmark Borrower Bill of Rights legislation, and now they're leading the charge to provide comprehensive rights for private student loan borrowers. Individually, each piece of legislation introduced by our panelists promises stronger protections and safer markets for students and student loan borrowers alike. Collectively, this legislation sends a message to the nation, not only of what can be done, but what must be done to protect borrowers. Following the first panel, we'll be joined by some of the advocates who are working every day on behalf of the millions of New Yorkers struggling under the weight of student loan debt. These advocates are organized to provide a powerful voice to push back against the special interests that too often drive policy. They are providing direct services and direct relief to borrowers who still haven't recovered from the last crisis, only to be thrust into another one. And they're fighting to keep the issues that plague our financial markets, like racial and economic injustice, front and center so that policymakers remain accountable to the communities they represent. They organized and fought and pushed back on the Trump DeVos agenda and helped New York pass expansive state level rights. But the fight isn't over, because even when it's our allies in DC, their work across the state of New York is a powerful force to raise the bar and demand better on behalf of student loan borrowers. So with that, I'd like to once again thank you all for joining us today and turn it over to Sbpc's Deputy Director of Advocacy and Civil Rights Counsel, Kat Welbeck.
Thanks, Seth. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kat Welbeck. I first just want to echo what Seth said and thank each of our panelists for joining us today. We're just so excited for each of you all to speak because, as Seth mentioned, the legislation that you all have introduced represents some of the most progressive, comprehensive set of student and student loan borrower protections of any state in the country. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this legislation is all moving now because, as we all see, and I think as we all know, student loan borrowers are really struggling right now, and the pandemic has only laid this reality more bare and made it more glaring. So what we see is that on top of unprecedented debt burdens, we have a market that's full of predatory actors looking to exploit borrowers who just simply want to get ahead by getting an education. And so we know that this has been the case for far too long. And we also know that this drives the efforts of many of our panelists are leading. And so while we're going to spend the majority of this panel discussing the legislation moving the session, I just want to take a moment to have each panelist talk about what led them to fight to protect borrowers, and then also how has the student debt crisis shaped their approach to policymaking. So with that, because I know you're not looking to hear from me, but you want to hear from our amazing panelists, let's just jump right in. I'm going to start with Senator Kevin Thomas. Senator Thomas represents Central Nassau County and currently serves as the chairman of the Consumer Protection Committee. Prior to his election, Senator Thomas served as an appointee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights to the New York State Advisory Committee, and also worked to advance civil rights and expand opportunities for all New Yorkers. And throughout his career, he has fought for consumer protections across the board, from data privacy to debt collection, and of course, student loans. So Senator Thomas, you have a storied history as a New York legal aid attorney who took on for-profit schools and the for-profit school complex. Could you just share a little bit about what drove you to take this fight from the courthouse to the State House?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kat, and to Sbpc and to Seth Frotman for putting this together. I started out as a legal services attorney in the Bronx, and I saw a lot of injustices happen there. I saw how financial institutions were taking advantage of the poor, and I needed policy to change to make it better for all of them. And that's why I ran for office. And that's why I sit here as the chair of consumer protection. And I pushed forward a number of bills to make it easier on them, on the lives of student loan borrowers, because they've been burdened with a lot of debt, and that's due to a lack of accountability by a lot of these servicers and finance companies that prey on them. So that's why I'm here, to make sure that consumers, especially student loan borrowers, are protected.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Thomas. And I'd now like to introduce Assemblymember Harvey Epstein, who has been fighting on behalf of New Yorkers for nearly 2 decades, leading some of the most notable housing protection lawsuits as the Community Development Director at the Urban Justice Center. He was also instrumental in creating the New York Legal Services Coalition, which has been a really powerful force for demanding justice for communities that we see are all too often harmed by this this broken system. And now as an assembly member, he's crafting laws that help the system work for people instead of against them. So Assemblymember Epstein, could you just share a little bit about how your work in housing and tenants' rights has affected your approach to policymaking? And then also, how are you using those lessons now as you work to expand rights for student loan borrowers?
Well, thank you, Kat. Thanks for including me. And you know, all of what Kevin said, it really applies to me as well. You know, a lot of our work in the legal services environment talks about income inequality, and we see how race, class, and power play out in really problematic ways. And whether that's around inequality in a landlord-tenant relationship and have tenants are disempowered in the systems of government and the levers of government and trying to equalize those power relations, or in the context of students, we see how borrowers just have manipulated students, and I've worked on litigation and legislation to try to equalize that, and it's became worse and worse over time. And I think that both the Assembly member and the Senate are realize that this power dynamic is really difficult for someone who's 18, who's an immigrant, who doesn't understand the system, to be able to go in and make a meaningful, impactful choice that affects the rest of their lives. And we see that play out where, you know, traditionally white students have less debt and they can pay it off over certain periods of time after 10 years. And you see mostly students of color, after they graduate or don't graduate, that debt continues for decades. So this is just the issue, the dynamics we see play out in housing and in economic development and in student loan borrowing. And we know that higher education is a pathway out for people, and we need to make that pathway much stronger for our young people who believe in higher education, and they are unfortunately getting tricked by a system that's set up against them.
Thank you, Assemblymember Epstein. And now I'd like to introduce our third panelist, Assemblymember Ken Zabrowski. Assemblymember Zabrowski has dedicated his entire career to public service in an effort to improve the lives of New York residents. And while he represents Rockland County, we know that his policymaking can be seen in every corner of the state. He is from public health to anti-discrimination policy to consumer protection. His work has made New York a leader in progressive rights. And so we're excited to have you here today. Assemblymember Zabrowski, could you tell us a little bit about your bill and your work?
Sure, thanks, Kat, and thanks everyone for your collaboration over the years and for having me here today, and to my two colleagues, Assemblymember Epstein and Senator Thomas, who I've worked with on various pieces of legislation. Look, I was elected at 26, and so I was only a few years out of law school at that point, and I can say I still have student loans that I'm still paying. I'm on a 30-year plan, so even though I am about halfway through, maybe a little bit longer. I sort of have that personal experience, but also have drawn a lot through my peers and through the folks I represent. I spent a year in the county legislature, worked in various, volunteered various not-for-profits in Rockland County, and I've been in the legislature for about 14 years now. And, you know, it's a barrier, student loans, student debt is a barrier for folks up and down the income spectrum to getting an ability to get a leg up and start to accumulate a level of economic security. And I think the thing that I've come to realize really early is that it's just sort of taken as a given. You know, when students come out of high school and start to go into college or into, you know, even to graduate school, it's just this esoteric sort of like concept that at some point, you know, I got to take these loans. Like I have no choice. And at some point I'll deal with it. And then at the point of graduation, it just was the Wild West. Misinformation, folks may get a job, lose a job, suffer a health issue themselves or a health issue of a family member, reach out for help, not know really to who to reach out to, be given information that digs the hole even further. And, you know, the federal government, which in some ways preempts the states, was not really stepping up to the plate, and states had to be creative in order to give relief, give the proper information, and to provide a level of security to their residents. And that's where, I've tried to step in. So, some of these, what I like to do in my career as a legislator is really tackle some of these issues from looking at it differently, trying to figure out a way where we can get around some of the federal preemption and protect our consumers here in New York, but also a willingness to get into the weeds. And I, as I said earlier, I've had the good fortune of having, great colleagues, two of whom are on here today, because, what we do on pages of a bill and in the halls of Albany may seem dry and complicated, but if you can do it right, it has positive ramifications in every corner of our state. And that's what we've attempting to do. So, and also we've had great partners that have helped us and given us the data and the tools necessary to pass those things. So I'll just end with a couple of the things I've worked on in my career, from the Student Loan Borrower Bill of Rights to regulating student debt consultants. I think both of those I worked on with Senator Thomas. We have a bill now where we're attempting to regulate private loan servicers and the way that they treat cosigners and things like that. And we've also gone into the broader financial space, dealing with like last year we passed a landmark bill, Senator Thomas and I, that dealt with small business loan disclosures. So there's just so many areas of financial regulation that we can make a difference in people's lives. They're complicated issues, but at the end of the day, we need to rein in these large companies. And sometimes they're not even large companies. They're like the middle person who's attempting to make a buck off the back of student loan borrowers that are already, a step back of attempting to get forward in their lives. So it's been my pleasure to work with agencies like this and not-for-profits and my colleagues to attempt to make a difference in New Yorkers' lives.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Zabrowski. And one thing that, as we start to jump into our questions, one thing I think that you all touched upon in doing your work is just how broad this crisis is and how it really touches every aspect of borrowers' lives. And, we hear a lot about the student debt crisis nationally. Like Seth said earlier, 45 million people who collectively owe $1.7 trillion. But one thing I really want us to talk about in this first question is the local impacts of the student debt crisis that sometimes we don't always hear about as much. So, I'm thinking of the small business owner who may not be able to get a loan because of a defaulted student loan, or the family that is struggling to buy a home because, student loan payments don't allow them to save for a down payment, or even thinking about the intergenerational burden of student debt and how it can hamper some families' ability to save for their children's college because, they're still paying down their student loans. And so what we're beginning to see is that research is showing that student debt affects different communities in different ways. And so one thing I would love to do is hear from each of you and how student debt is affecting your constituents in your community. And so maybe I'll just pick Assemblymember Epstein. Would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And I just don't want to ignore the racialized impact of student debt. We see that Latino students have 4 times more likely to default on student loans than white students. We see in a big issue that Senator Thomas and I focuses on the for-profit colleges. And then we see, even though they're only 3% of the students are attending for-profit institutions, we see levels of almost 47% of the default rates from these for-profit institutions. So I think it's really critical to be thinking about where the defaults are happening and who it's happening to, right? And then I think what Ken was talking about is like how complicated this is. I know when I was in college, I didn't really understand what debt was what. I didn't understand government debt versus private debt. When I went to law school, like all 3 of us are lawyers here, so we all went to law school, and then we had to figure out that debt and how to manage that and what the impact it was. I don't know, as a lawyer, I still didn't understand it. I came out of law school, I was like, What debt do I have? How do I repay it? How do I consolidate it? What doesn't make any sense? And this is after I finished law school. So for someone who, I had two parents who were English speakers who grew up in this country. They went to, went to school locally, and, they didn't, luckily at that time, like Brooklyn College was free, so my dad didn't have to worry about that. But they understood the system, and it's much more complicated for our immigrant parents who are helping their children navigate the system. And that's where we see a lot of this fraud. There's not clear information. Kevin and I have this transparency bill where we're saying, well, why don't we compare apples to apples? How do you look at a for-profit, a nonprofit, or a public school and make sure what you're buying for? There's no simple way to get this information. And we see this happening in my district, in my community all the time, where in parts of my district where you have whiter, wealthier families, that they can do the homework and do the effort to fill out the FAFSA and understand the system. And when we have, and part of my district where it's mostly people of color and lower income people, parents don't understand the process well enough to assist their child in getting through it. And that we've seen more problems being created with those families. So that's race and class based. In a district where I represent the Lower East Side, East Side of Manhattan, I mean, I represent from north of Williamsburg Bridge to north of the UN. It's a very different district when you're at Tudor City by the UN or Gramercy Park than you are where I live down the Lower East Side. And people have very different experience of it. So we have to understand that family ability and family impact and how it's being dealt with is really critical in how we educate and invest in people and help them understand how to move forward. So I do think not every person has the same experience. My kids have a much different experience than other kids because they have me to help them through the process.
Thank you, Assemblymember Epstein. I really just love also you bringing in the equity piece about student debt and really just understanding that there is a deep racial disparities in this crisis. So thank you for bringing attention to that. And would Senator Thomas or Assemblymember Zabrowski?
Sure. I'll take the question. This is very unique in my community since I'm from Long Island. Recent data prior to the COVID crisis from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York showed that Long Island's average student loan balance was startling around $35,000, a larger total than the state average of $34,600 and a national average of $32,700. You have countless Long Island millennials and their parents that are facing tens of thousands of dollars in college debt. And this is according to federal data and financial experts. And their burden is made even heavier by the region's high cost of living. Local economic numbers are showing this as well. Of every 10 millennials here, 6 are living with their parents or roommates, and only 2 own a home, according to census data analyzed by the Long Island Association, the region's largest business group. And over the past 25 years, the crisis has made it a struggle to keep young Long Islanders from moving away. In 1990, the number of 25, 34-year-olds hit a peak of 430,400. And by 2016, the total stood at about 327,000. And 2/3 still lived at home, census figures show. So this is impacting Long Island very uniquely from the rest of the state.
And I'll just add to that, Kat, a couple things. My district in Rockland County, I guess, all 3 of us are sort of downstate legislators, although I don't know if Harvey and Kevin would consider Rockland County downstate. I think some, different people have different lines. It's a long running debate in Albany, but certainly if you look at the map, I'm downstate. Being a Rockland's a New York City suburb, it's extremely expensive place to live. So I have portions of my district where folks are the first generation to have an attempt to go to college, and like Assemblymember Epstein said, are attempting to navigate. They live in a multi-generational housing house, maybe in the village of Haverstraw or somewhere, and attempting to navigate this without a lot of familial backup or institutional support. And that's where we really need to help folks. And you could drive 5 or 10 minutes to a wealthier portion of my district and still have folks that are paying $15,000-$20,000 in property taxes, a little higher on the economic spectrum, but also not necessarily feeling that they're awash in cash, if you will, and their kids are also taking out loans. So it affects, like I said, across the income spectrum. And one thing that I think you mentioned, Kat, that I would just add, because my colleagues touched on a lot, is that it snowballs, right? So folks that fall into financial trouble through student loans then will pay higher in a car loan because their credit score will be lower. They pay higher in a mortgage. We've tried to do some work on what folks can look at and not look at it in terms of housing. And in rental applications and things like that. So it snowballs. So the folks that need the most help most times to get back on their feet are the folks that are most disadvantaged by the economic system. And that's really some of the barriers we need to focus on breaking down.
Thank you, Assemblymember Zabrowski. And I think it's a really great point to end this question and kind of transition to our next question, because I really love adding that secret cost of debt and understanding that, in addition to the balances, there are costs that borrowers pay across their lives, but also tying in both to what Assemblymember Epstein was saying about the racial disparities, but also what Assemblymember Thomas was saying about, really understanding of what it means to struggle, because even in high cost areas, and something you also touched on, Assemblymember Zabrowski, like expanding our understanding of what it means to struggle with student debt. And so I know that now we have more of our national conversation turning to, well, with a new federal administration, I think we can expect more federal action on student debt, even broader conversations about, debt cancellation, all these things. So sometimes we hear from some corners, well, why do we need to do this anymore at the state level? We think we're going to have federal action. Do you all want to talk a little bit more about why it's so critical to still have state action, even when we think or can hope for federal action on student debt? And I'll let whoever wants to jump in first start.
I'll go first. I mean, I would say this: we just cannot count on the federal government, right? There are a number of issues the states have to step up on, and this is one major policy, because the past 8 years has shown that we just cannot rely on the federal government to come together and push forward with a piece of legislation like this that is so important. There's no guarantee that the federal government will pass anything. There's no guarantee that they will pass something that's good. And there's never a guarantee that the federal government is going to enforce the laws that it passes in a meaningful way. Right. This is exactly why Assemblymember Zabrowski and I, when we pushed forward with the student loan servicer bill that was going to hold them accountable here in the state, we did it because the federal government was not taking proper action. And there's really no downside to additional protections or rights at the state level, or to having additional oversight from a state agency, because kind of we know our citizens better than the federal government does. So that's my take on it.
The only thing I would add to what Kevin said is, even whatever the federal government does, it'll be a floor. And we in New York can provide additional protection to those students who need it. And I think it's going to be hard to compromise on the federal level, and it takes a lot to get things through Congress. And we on the state level have an opportunity with a supermajority in the Assembly and the Senate to pass really comprehensive legislation that might be much more difficult in Washington. And I think we have started doing that, and I think we will continue to do that for students.
Yeah, and just that, as we've seen, even when there's laws in place, there can be wildly different regulatory actions taken from one administration to the next. And so while 4 years seems like a long time, it can go by in a snap. And, on the state level, we can provide some continuity of protections.
Wonderful. And I think you all, those are just really great great explanation just talking about, I loved hearing that, you know, the federal regulation is a floor, not a ceiling, and states really can step in and do more, and really speaking to the urgency of this moment and really standing in to protect student loan borrowers. So I think that also leads us really well to our next question. In 2019, Senator Thomas and Assemblymember Zabrowski, you all passed one of the most effective student loan borrower bill of rights in this country. And we see that in 2 short years, millions of New York student loan borrowers have already benefited. And so now, as the 3 of you are introducing this suite of legislation that expands borrower protections, including, like I think we heard earlier, for private student loan borrowers, can you talk a little bit more? And I think you all touched a little bit on this on the last question about why it's so necessary and how specifically these suite of bills build upon the 2019 Borrower Bill of Rights. And whoever wants to jump in.
I went first last time, so I'll let someone else do it.
Sure. So, right, we're attempting to continue to build on the progress we've made, and I think, as we said, probably both of us on the floor at that time, that was just a start, that sort of like brought the regulatory power of New York to bear on some of these student loan servicers, but there's so many different areas. So one in particular that we're working on is sort of these private student loans, and there's so many issues that we've heard from constituents and people across New York of, you know, where they've been taken advantage of. I mean, oftentimes these loans have, you know, extremely high interest rates and really no like flexibility. And when they fall behind, they're subject to aggressive sort of debt collection tactics. And then, you know, even some of the more heartbreaking situations where, you know, there's co-signers and maybe the initial borrower might pass away, and sort of the predatory and aggressive tactics that are taken, and some of the contractual like footnotes almost, if you will, that require some of these loans to be like paid immediately. And some of these things aren't known to the co-signers. You know, they're trying to help out a child or a niece or a nephew or a grandchild to you know, to get the loan. As we sort of talked about earlier, you know, we have a barrier to access of loans too. And it's trying to standardize some of these contracts and the co-signer requirements and those type of things. So that's a little bit of what we are working on for this session to build on it.
And I'll just add 2 things that I'll add to that. I think Ken's right. I think the story I grew up with was education was the opportunity out. It was it's a way of the path forward for all of us. And, you know, as the 3 of us, I don't know about you, Kat, but we all went to law school, and we value education. But for so many people, it's a myth, not the reality, right? They go to a school and then they owe $50, so they can't get their transcript to transfer from their associate's program to their undergraduate program. They can't get their diploma because some other thing is holding them up. The system is so struggling. They don't really understand. There are so many barriers in front of people to be able to do what they need to do, that is critical that we make it clear and we make it easy, and we stop this predatory tactics. You know, a simple example is, you know, if someone's in default and our state of New York is trying to collect on that, someone has to go to Albany to defend their case. Well, if you're a New York City resident and they claim you owe $5,000 and you dispute it, it might cost you $5,000 to still appear in Albany for the 3 times you need to go to court. So there are really basic things that we need to do to help people who have arrears, who are attempting to go to college and are on the other end of it. And each requires legislative fixes that I know the 3 of us are focusing on to help those fixes happen to protect really vulnerable students.
I'll just add to all of that. Listen, the Borrower Bill of Rights is intended to help student loan borrowers having difficulty communicating or locating their student loan service. It was like the first step towards addressing one of the many issues that create and perpetuate student loan debt. The legislation I've introduced this year targets other issues with higher education, like the cost that force students to take on loans. I have a bill that freezes tuition at SUNY and CUNY for 5 years and incrementally increases the max TAP award during that period. The bill also directs the Board of Trustees at both institutions to investigate and propose funding sources to keep tuition affordable. I also have legislation with Assemblymember Epstein that requires all degree granting institutions to make annual disclosures. Disclosures like this would empower students to decide if the cost of the school is worth it. Right now, students have to enroll before they can see whether or not schools prioritize academic support and student services. With this bill, students would have access to that information prior to taking out loans and enrolling. They could see if a $45,000 a year school actually offers more than the $20,000 that they take out.
Thank you. And all wonderful, wonderful answers talking about the importance of this legislation. And I think one thing, and again, a theme hearing throughout is thinking about, again, borrowers were struggling before. We know, student debt has grown exponentially in the past decade, and borrowers are already struggling before, and you all are thinking about really meaningful solutions to help borrowers across the market. But one thing that we've seen, especially in the last year, is that the pandemic has really exacerbated a lot of those other struggles that we saw already. So could you all talk a little bit about, I know you're talking about broadly how the bill protects borrowers, but can you talk about specifically thinking about in terms of pandemic recovery, what these suite of bills will mean for student loan borrowers in New York?
I guess I'll go first, right? I recently introduced legislation that would prohibit higher education institutions from withholding transcripts from students who owe money. That's one thing. Transcript withholding prevents students from re-enrolling in school to finish a degree or to qualify for jobs. It seems wrong that during a pandemic, colleges and universities would withhold transcript, often for very small amounts, to the extreme detriment of students. Transcript withholding becomes even more egregious act when you think about how many students are dropping out of school during the pandemic. There was not enough attention last March paid to the fact that college campuses might very well be the only place where a student has consistent access to food, shelter, or internet without disruption. When the situation for these students improves, they should be able to return to school without the additional obstacle of paying off institutional debts. And for returning students who completed at least 75% of their undergraduate degree or certificate program, the bill also creates a grant program that would funnel funds from the existing college access challenge grant to cover up to 100% of tuition.
So I guess I'll jump in. So a bunch of things. So we need to empower student loan borrowers. Obviously, look, during the pandemic, it's affected people in so many different ways, and things have happened that we could never predict. I mean, when would we ever predict that like every business would shut down for a period of time? I mean, you have residents out there that may have had a primary job that they just couldn't go to, or a second job that still isn't open, as restaurants are still not at capacity, things that you just couldn't predict. So we need to empower. So some of the things the bill does sort of empower student loan borrowers against debt collection practices, ensure that they have the information necessary to exert their rights, to establish certain regulations and protect against predatory practices. Those are the type of things that some of the legislation will do. And then also, just to piggyback on some of the things that Senator Thomas and Assemblyman Epstein have said already, is right now we're in the middle of a budget process. So in addition to all the legislative things we're doing, I think I can speak for all three of us when we say we're doing everything we can to ensure that folks aren't taking on more debt than they need to by closing things like the TAP gap and making sure that higher education is funded, and that we provide unemployment insurance where we can, that we protect folks that have fallen through the cracks, that we provide social services to folks who need it. So there's a holistic financial message here and financial picture that we need to address that ends up having as much to do with student loan borrowers as our actual student loan borrower legislation does, with their entire financial picture.
And just to add, if I could, because I do think we need to have new conversations about what education is. We talk about K through 12, and maybe we need to talk about 3K through 16, and really think about this as a comprehensive plan, because we need to be supporting people's lives throughout it, whether it's what Kevin and I are doing on, on not getting transcripts, or it's, people lost semesters because of COVID. Now they're capped at what TAP award they can have. We're trying to get legislation passed saying, during this time, can they get extra semesters of TAP just so they can continue with their schooling because they had to drop out, they lost a family member, they were sick. There's so many things that are happening in people's lives that we as a government can control. Pre-K through 16 could be, from 12, my son gets a Metro card when he goes to school, but when he goes to college, he doesn't get that Metro card. Maybe we should allow that. There's access to, they have free lunch at school. So kids who are lower income access to free food. Why does that not exist in college? Why are we seeing our college kids waiting on food pantry line and thinking they're going to wait for that event at school that day so that they can have the one meal a day that they're going to get? We need to think about education in a comprehensive way, and then we need to think about debt in a comprehensive way. And I think that's what we're all trying to get towards. How do we ensure that kids who need access, our younger people need access to a higher education that doesn't crush them at the end? And that's what we're seeing happening to so many people in my community and all of our communities around the state and around the nation. And how do we stop that? And we need to do it piece by piece, but we also need to think about the long picture in this conversation.
Kat, so I sorry to take an extra, like one other bill that I was thinking about that is important is, folks hit financial calamity this year. So too often something like TAP goes 2 years back in your tax returns when you didn't have the financial issues. So I have a bill now also that will allow folks to utilize information from this year.
Wonderful. And just another thank you all for being such, wonderful champions for student loan borrowers in your communities more broadly. I think we have about 1 minute left. And so I just wanted to give everyone a chance to say anything that I may not have asked or that you wanted to share, didn't have a chance to before we close out this panel.
I think I took my extra minute, so I'll just say thanks for having me today.
And I'll just say quickly that I think we need to stop thinking about debt as a ball and a chain on people's lives, and think about how we structure the entire system to encourage and support people, not weigh them down. Thank you for letting me be here.
I'm going to say the same as well, and thank Assemblymember Epstein and Assemblymember Zabrowski for being such great partners in this, and looking forward to improving the lives of students going forward.
And I just wanted to circle back and thank you all so much, Senator Thomas, Assemblymember Epstein, Assemblymember Zabrowski. Thank you all so much. I mean, this time went by so fast. I feel like there's so many things we would have loved to continue to ask you all. But again, thank you all so much for being here today. And again, for leading the work on really protecting student loan borrowers. So thank you so much. And we're really excited to have such an amazing first panel. We have another panel of advocates following on right after this. So thank you all so much.
So now we're going to shift gears into our second panel. Kat Welder, do you want to open it up?
For sure. And so again, I'm Kat Welbeck. I think everyone who was just on is still on. I don't know if we had any new people join us in this last minute, but we just had a wonderful first panel with legislators who have been wonderful champions for student loan borrowers in the State House. And we are really fortunate for our second panel to be joined by an amazing, amazing panel of advocates who have also been leading this work and working directly on behalf of student loan borrowers through clients or through research and advocacy. So we're just really excited to have you all here today. So as we start this panel, what we're going to do is I'm going to jump into the first question just to kind of get us rolling right away. But what I would just ask is that all of our panelists introduce themselves as we go through this first set of questions. And we're just we're gonna kick it right off if that works for everyone. Okay, awesome. So this is something we also kind of discussed a little bit during the first panel, but we see that we have a new administration in town. President Biden won the election. We have new leadership in the Department of Education. And so a lot of people are like, we have federal action. So, and we see we're, hopeful for more federal action on student debt. Why do we still need state action when we think things are going to get better at the federal level? And so I can maybe call on, I think Carolina here and others can jump in as we go along.
Sure. So my name is Carolina Rodriguez. I'm the director of the Education Debt Consumer Assistance Program, which is a program dedicated to helping borrowers, whether they have issues or need to explore the repayment options, have defaulted student loans, and that includes help with federal loans, private loans, and direct school debt. So basically any higher education issue related to debt, we can help. So that is such a great question. And I think I'm going to echo what panel one was echoing, that we cannot rely on the federal government to take action, right? We should not be holding our breath every 4 years as to whether we're going to have consistent protections for New Yorkers. And I always want to step back and remind ourselves the role of higher education in context within a state, right? Higher education and education in general is a very state and local issue. And we should continue to remember that, because the impact of this debt burden is felt at the local level. It is felt by our neighbors or family members or economy, right? So in New York, it is in New York's best interest to take action again to increase consumer protections. And I'm going to say the lack of oversight that we've witnessed at the federal level has been astonishing, right? Like the federal student aid is responsible for having oversight, and they have failed to do that. There are actual government reports around that, and all the safety measures that are supposed to protect federal borrowers, like caps on loan amount that they can borrow, that has not worked. What has happened is they max their federal loan borrowing, and then they have to turn into private student loans, which is worse, right? Public service loan forgiveness, other forgiveness programs have failed miserably. So again, it is critical that the state take action to provide that consistent protection New Yorkers need.
I'll jump in next. My name is Anna Anderson. I'm the supervising attorney of the consumer practice at Legal Assistance of Western New York, which is based upstate. We serve 14 counties in Western New York, and I'm physically based in Rochester. I of course will echo what everyone else is saying, but I want to mention that not all student debt is federally held. And a significant amount of borrowers were left out of the CARES Act, including students with private loans, students who owed tuition debt directly to schools or to New York State, and students who had federal FFEL loans. They were all left out of the CARES Act. So I will say that even those students who were protected there, there's still some gaps. And even under the CARES Act, we saw problems with how that was implemented. So supposedly, borrowers were supposed to have their debt collection issues stopped during the pandemic as a result of the CARES Act. But we were seeing that that was not true. In fact, very early on after the CARES Act was passed, we got a call from a client who was a home healthcare worker, and she was having her wages garnished by the federal government for her student loan debt in direct violation of the CARES Act. And this was devastating to her financially, especially as her hours were cut at her job due to the pandemic. So luckily, we were able to reach out to NCLC and the Student Borrower Protection Center, and we discovered that this was impacting not just our client, but tens of thousands of other students and borrowers across the country. And our client actually became the lead plaintiff in the Barber v. DeVos case against the Department of Education to stop this. So you can see that there are a lot of gaps in relying solely on federal policies and the federal administration to resolve this crisis.
And I'd love to jump in here. Hi, folks. Good afternoon. My name is Melanie Kruvelis, and I'm here with Young Invincibles. We're a national nonprofit that's dedicated to elevating young adult voice in the political process. We do that across 4 key issue areas: healthcare, workforce development, civic engagement, and of course, higher education, which is what brings us here today and with these great panelists. And it's really great being here and working with you all. And thank you again to the elected officials who joined us earlier this afternoon. So again, just joining the echo train of what some of the folks have already said on this call, which, I think Anna just explained it well. And, I heard Assemblymember Epstein mention this in his remarks earlier today, right? That, while we're talking about, federal debt cancellation, which of course, one is not a guarantee, right? So we need to not act like it is. But at any rate, as the Assembly member was speaking on the earlier panel, he even mentioned that as a law student, he wasn't able to totally understand, which of my loans are federal, which of my loans are state, which are due directly to, my institution, which are due to private loan companies. It's really complicated. And from, a student level, while lawmakers may be able to compartmentalize like what part of the student debt crisis they want to work on, students aren't able to compartmentalize what types of debt that they are that they owe and that they are being harassed in a lot of ways to make payments on. And I think that really matters, right? Especially as we're starting to see this huge movement across the country to put pressure on the administration to cancel student debt. I think messaging matters, right? And if we know that part of the impetus for canceling some forms of federal student debt is, an issue of equity, is recognizing that this crisis has a different impact on students of color than it does for white students, then I don't understand why, we wouldn't have that same exact lens for these other forms of debt that are going to be included. And again, I think for borrowers, if you're hearing this message that, my debt's being canceled, that's what's happening, like, that's amazing. But at the end of the day, if you can't parse out which debt is what, it's going to be, devastating to hear that, even despite all this energy, that your debt is still there, and all of the, consequences of that debt are still on you and on your family. And so, again, I think that it's important to, for the reasons that some of my colleagues mentioned on the panel here, this is an area where New York has to lead. We have to take action on this. And just a last point here that, the state also has a responsibility because, state choices influence the debt crisis that we have today. Disinvestment in higher education, particularly in the last recession, was a huge impetus and a huge push and a huge reason why so many borrowers, in our network and across the state are struggling in the ways that they are. So this is absolutely an issue of state importance. So I'm glad to be here today.
And I'll go ahead and jump in next. My name is Tamara Cesaretti, and I'm a counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center. And I've been doing a lot of the work around the debt collection bills in various different states and now in New York. And I think I would just want to add that the reason we can't rely on the federal level is because the action there is so slow. As Melanie was just saying, we can't take cancellation as a guarantee because it might not happen over the next 4 years or 8 years or ever. So we recently saw there was a big win for borrower defense, but that win didn't even help everyone who has been defrauded by their schools. And that was only partial relief, even for people who were pursuing borrower defense. And that even took several months after inauguration. So things are moving so slow at the federal level that these protections are needed on a state level as well, because borrowers are being dragged into court every single day. And it doesn't matter what's going on the federal level, that's still happening.
Yeah, hi, my name is Joe Davidson. I'm one of the supervising attorneys at DC 37 Mel's, which is, we are an somewhat in-house legal services organization available to the members of DC 37, which are primarily municipal employees of the city of New York. We have a number of departments, and I'm on a very busy department these days, consumer, where we handle a lot of debt issues from all sorts of angles. And I think I really can't say, it was Anna Anderson. I'm so glad that you pointed that out about how much debt is held by the state, because I think it gets forgotten because we all keep looking at Washington to see what they're going to do. But so many people are in so much trouble with state debt and tuition, and there are so many people that have been left out because of the types of loans that they had that were maybe not direct, as Anna said. But I think the thing that keeps bringing me up short, and the reason I would like to see New York, I think the reason I hope all states actually begin to take an interest in what's going on with student debt held by the government, federal government, is because so much of the available options of resolution or management, it's a blanket approach, and it is not appropriate to each state. The cost of living in New York is very, very high compared to the cost of living in other states. And some of the most affordable payment plans are the income-driven repayment plans. Those are the best options for most of my clients. Unfortunately, the way that the formula is set to measure what is available to them in terms of the way that their monthly payment would be set up, the formula just looks at the poverty level for the lower 48 states, and that's it. It does not take into consideration what it costs to live in New York. And so, what I bump into constantly is that even the least expensive plans for somebody making $50,000 a year living in New York, a single parent with one kid, they can't afford it. It's not possible, even on IBR, the cheapest, which is 15% of the of income, what's considered discretionary income. And so I don't think that I would like to see state legislatures and lawmakers start using their influence in Congress to start to address what it means to set repayment based on one single idea of what cost of living in the United States is, because it's completely inappropriate. And one of the other things that I have a huge concern about that also seems to go out the window with a lot of these is the issues. My clients don't think about it. Advocates, we think about it, but I don't always hear it discussed. When people aren't paying their loans, extraordinary amounts of interest are accruing, and it's swelling their debts exponentially, far beyond anything that they ever borrowed. And all it does with every passing day is make it less likely that they're going to be able to ever repay it. They're not going to, it's not only are they not going to be able to repay it, but I have people who have, this is another thing I would like to see the state take an interest in. I have people whose Social Security is being garnished, retirees. That is shocking to me. These people are living on a pittance, and it's up to $750 is being taken to satisfy student debt. These people are in their 70s. It's outrageous to me. And so I feel very strongly that the federal government is not going to be paying attention to this anytime soon. I desperately would like to see the state take an interest in all of these kinds of issues, because the ramifications are dire. They really are.
Thank you, Joe. And just to circle back, just talking about like you're saying, like the ramifications of debt and not being able to pay are dire, and who's really being disproportionately affected by student debt. I wanted to circle back to something that Melanie just brought up, and it's something that that Assemblymember Epstein brought up in the first panel, and just talking about thinking about like the equity case for talking about like student debt and racial disparities and talking about racial equity. So one thing I want to talk about is how does the student debt crisis disproportionately affect communities of color?
And I can go ahead and start, because today we're putting out a new report on these issues, and specifically looking at a case study of one company called the National Collegiate Student Loan Trust in New York, and that's a debt collector in New York. And what we've found looking at the cases that they bring against borrowers is that from January 2015 through December 2020, there was a disparate impact based on zip codes. The New York's 3 counties that are majority minority or majority non-white, there are only 3 of them, and they had over 44% of these lawsuits, which is just really incredible to think about. And there were 2.6 times higher cases in majority minority counties than in majority white counties. So we're really seeing that this is negatively affecting communities of color, and those communities are also facing the brunt of the coronavirus crisis, and these cases are continuing to be brought during the coronavirus crisis. Even after courts were closed, when they reopened, these cases were continued to be brought, especially in the majority minority zip codes. So this is definitely affecting communities of color disproportionately.
And I'm going to echo that. I think I always say that people who are struggling the most in other areas, right, like healthcare, housing, food insecurity, are struggling the most when it comes to student loan debt, and that is true. I think a couple of things. One thing is to note that this issue is impacting people across ages, right, and socioeconomic status. Like, that's a given. Everyone is bearing the brunt. I think the second aspect is some people are way worse off, right? And what that means is like the impact long term, right? So when we have people that are entering retirement with this student loan debt, you can only imagine they were not able to save for retirement. You can imagine that if they were not able to purchase a home, they cannot use that equity to retire. So we can see this pattern that if the current 30 to 40 age population is paying for their own debt, they won't be able to save to buy that home on time, to build that equity. They won't be able to save to pay for their kids' education. So we're just going to create this vicious cycle. And at the end of the day, the state is going to pay for this, because what's going to happen when you have an aging population that doesn't have savings to retire, that doesn't have appropriate health care, that ends up having food insecurity. So it goes back to the theme of like states really need to pay attention to this issue. As Joe was saying, like we need to take an interest and push on this, right? From a race ethnicity perspective, in my practice, African Americans are my highest client base. From a gender perspective, women hold 2/3 of the total debt. In my practice, 75% of my clients are women. And this week we had like the gender pay gap day. Imagine if you can get a few more cents, you could potentially be able to pay off that debt, right? And I've had clients who have been dealing with student debt for 50 years. And when I ask them, what do you think contributed to your inability to pay it off eventually? And gender pay, lack of opportunities, employment opportunities. I mean, it compiles, and there is a direct impact that eventually harms them for decades. So yes, definitely echo in terms of the inequities in communities who are already suffering, are still suffering the most in this area.
I'll jump onto that as well, if that's okay. We too are seeing that the student debt crisis acutely affects our most vulnerable populations. So communities of color, women. I'll also echo that the majority of my clients are women. And increasingly, as folks have said, we are seeing some troubling statistics in terms of our seniors who are impacted by this, as well as rural borrowers. I'm upstate, so I represent a lot of folks who are in rural settings who don't have access to legal resources. There's usually only one law firm in town, let alone a legal aid firm that could represent you for free. So there's a lot of access issues that we're seeing there. And to echo the problems with the National Collegiate Student Loan Trust, we have a case right now. We're representing a senior who lives in a rural area who does not have access to lawyers outside of our minimal assistance that we can provide. And she's been sued 6 times by the National Collegiate Student Loan Trust for loans that she allegedly co-signed on, although we're arguing that her name was forged. She didn't even co-sign on these loans. The debt collector in that case, in all of those cases, I should say, they don't care that these loans were fraudulent, that these loans were forged, and that she doesn't owe this debt. They don't care that her only income is from Social Security benefits. They're just hoping to pressure her and stress her out to the point of giving up, so that she will eventually just decide to prioritize paying this bad debt over caring for her family. And we're seeing that across the board in all of our vulnerable communities as well. I will also just add to, in terms of the racial disparities, I think the biggest issue we're seeing why people of color are so disproportionately impacted by the student debt crisis is the problem with for-profit colleges and the problem with for-profit schemes. Many of my clients who are from communities of color who have student loan debt, a lot of them were never able to finish their schooling because they were a victim of some sort of for-profit college scam, and they have not been able to get any kind of compensation or any kind of loan discharge through the borrower defense to repayment program. So that is a big thing that I think we should point out and talk about as well. And that's what I wanted to add there.
Yeah.
One of the things I would say I see a fair amount of is and I haven't had a chance to like really sort of go back into the books and sort of look around at what's actually going on out there. But what I do find with a lot of families of color, and particularly women, is they've taken extraordinary amounts of debt far out of line with the education, very often with what they received or what they got for a child. Parent Plus loans are a big problem, by the way. But like I have a client now who's staring down $180,000 in Parent Plus loan debt, not with interest, to get her son to undergrad from John Jay. And I don't, it's not impossible, of course, but this is almost the balance of an advanced education. And I see a lot of, I'm not sure why I'm seeing with so many families of color and with immigrant families, outlandish amounts of debt for undergraduate degrees from not particularly, these kids did not go to Harvard. I don't know exactly why that's happening, but I don't see that that's a very unusual pattern that I'm seeing. There's no reason. Her son lived at home the entire 4 years he was at John Jay. There's no reason for $180,000, and I would love to know. But she says that my client has just reported that she was told that this is what she needed, and I don't know how she spent it. She's very quiet about that. I think there's a lot of shame around the whole entire situation, so I have difficulty getting background information on it. So I'm just working on trying to help her resolve it, and I may end up having to look to the bankruptcy court in her case. But in general, I do see a lot of like astronomical student loan debt for not particularly expensive educations.
Yeah, just to add on to what folks have already shared, I think Anna brought up a point earlier about non-completion and how that impacts this student debt crisis. And, I think that's a really big part of the story. Anna sort of pointed it out as particularly egregious at some of these for-profit colleges, which, again, data across the board certainly tells that story. But, of course, we see non-completion issues across institution types, right? We see it at, we see this at public colleges, we see this at non-profit schools, we see it at the for-profits as well. And so, I think that's really important because, I think there's research out there that shows that, students who are unable to complete their degree, but, did take out loans in order to go to school in the first place, those are some of the students who are most likely to enter into default because of these loans. And, when you stop and think about it, there's, a certain amount of logic to that, just in terms of if you entered into school, and then again, for a variety of reasons, whether it's, taking care of a family member who's gotten sick because, or, having to take care of, a child, or all sorts of reasons why people end up needing to leave school, to, tend to their own mental health, again, all of these things that have only been exacerbated in COVID, it makes sense that people, may need to leave school. But then, of course, when that loan comes due, they're not equipped with that credential that then, allows them to get some of these higher paying jobs, or, jobs that are actually going to help them get on the path to even paying these off to begin with. And so, and again, there's been research from, the city of New York, the Department of, I always say it's Consumer Affairs. I know they changed their acronym since then, but at any rate, they've put out research that shows that non-completion is a huge problem in New York and disproportionately impacts low-income students and students of color. And so, again, just on this theme of the sort of responsibility of the state to address some of these issues, I think, again, there are programs that, sort of on the front end do help students, complete college, that do support students and make them stay on track. I think about programs like, CUNY ASAP and all of these amazing programs that New York does have that, really do try to prevent students from, having to leave school just, due to lack of support on campus. But when we're not investing in those programs, and then, again, for students who are in institutions that don't even provide any of these programs, this is another thing that yet again balloons the student debt crisis and, really makes it an issue of equity, both for, borrowers of color as well as low-income borrowers.
And thanks so much, Melanie, for that. And just something to touch on about really understanding the need to support, especially students understanding coming from low wealth households. And I think, Carolina, you touched on something earlier, is that we know that communities that are already struggling broadly with other issues across like the consumer finance market will also likely struggle with student debt. And just wanted to circle back on touching on especially the racial wealth gap, as we see communities of color is struggling with the student debt crisis, understanding that when borrowers come from households with less wealth, they are going to be more likely to take on more student debt. And again, that cut into wealth building opportunities across their lifetime. So really glad that we can touch on that and talk about like who's struggling and why. And one thing, again, to shift gears a little bit, talking about the legislation that we talked a lot about on the first panel, and understanding also why there's a need to increase protections for private student loan borrowers and co-signers. So, we talk a little bit about, who's struggling with student debt and understanding, it's across races, across age, it's a broad facing crisis, but would love to hear you all talk a little bit more about the prominent issues that you all are seeing when you're helping student loan borrowers with their private student loan debt.
I'm gonna start. So there are two types of cases that I fear getting, right? And those are people who have private student loan issues and people with direct to school debt, right? That's when people usually call us and say, I owe my school X amount of money and I cannot get my transcript release, I cannot get my diploma in the event that they finish. When it comes to private student loans, especially amid this pandemic, you get the caller who says, I co-sign on $100,000 for my son or for my daughter. I'm having to refinance my house. I need to be off this loan. And the reality is that I know that getting off, meaning co-signer release, it's near impossible because the student borrower has to show that they've been able to pay for at least a year to 2 years, that they've never asked for a forbearance. So you can imagine right now, amid this pandemic, the number one solution is like, can we stop the payment at least for a few months to get you back up on track, right? Well, the moment you do that, the private lender now flags the red card and says, well, you're not going to be eligible for co-signer release pretty much ever. So the legislation that we're looking at in New York State is amazing because it brings back a little bit of that leverage playing field by protecting consumers, making it more transparent for co-signers to know that if I ever want to be out of this loan, these are the steps I must take, right? It creates some transparency from the private lender in terms of like, you must outline your requirements. Other stories, I had a grandmother who had co-signed on 3 of her grandkids' loans, right? And she had an investment property and she wanted to refinance. Again, it goes back to an initial activity that prompts them for them to come to us. Well, her co-signing on 3 loans means that she's 100% on the hook for those loans. So she couldn't do it, right? So I ended up having to work with each of the grandkids to address their specific loans. And this grandmother felt like horrible. She said, I didn't teach them well. And it's like this guilt of like feeling that they wanted to help them, and yet they contributed to all three grandkids being in this situation, right? So there's a lot happening, and I'm sure my other colleagues will mention this. Whenever someone co-signs and things go wrong, it ruins relationships, it ruins family dynamics, and the impact is more than the financial impact, I want to say. And I'm going to say something super quick before I forget. I think when we look at other legislation for other crises we face in New York State, I always think about the housing crisis. So I finished law school when we had a lot of foreclosures happening in New York State, but a lot of really good things came out. And I was one of those counselors, right? A lot of things came out of that, including a Bill of Rights. We now have for student borrowers a Bill of Rights. There were protections regarding the pre-foreclosure notices, making sure that the debts were actual debts, meaning that the person suing actually held that debt, and all those good stuff. So I feel that some of these initial bills are trying to replicate those consumer protections. And right now, it's going to be the testament of whether all those protections and additional consumer assistance programs are going to help within the housing realm. I think we can definitely use that model. And I feel like some of these bills have used that model to create a similar leverage for consumers as we try to tackle this crisis and move forward.
And I think that's such a great parallel between the two crises. And one thing, Carolina, is just you touched also on having an older client with student debt, and I know that that's something Anna touched on in the last question. So Anna, I would love to hear if like you have any client stories also talking about older adults with student debt.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have way too many stories to share about older clients with student debt. We're getting more and more calls. I think we get at least a few calls a week from seniors with student debt. And the cosigner issue is particularly troubling because this is about wealth building, right? These seniors who are coming to us who said, I co-signed on my grandson's loans, or I co-signed on my nephew's loans. They're doing it because they do not have any assets or income that they know they will be able to pass on to their family members. And they're hoping to set them up for future success. These are folks who have been disadvantaged for a really long time, who are just trying to do the right thing and just trying to, achieve that American dream that we all were supposedly promised, right? So then to be in a situation where the grandson or the nephew, through no fault of their own, often can't pay the loans back because of their own particular circumstances that we've all kind of discussed on these calls. It's so troubling, and it does affect you more than just financially. It tears families apart. We've had so many calls from people who have just said, I've cut my grandkids off completely because I just am so stressed about this. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to hear that. I mean, just this week, we spoke to a senior who is at risk of losing her housing because she cannot get a new loan through her bank to make necessary repairs on her home, which means she might have to leave and she might have to go into some type of assisted living. And it's because of these private student loans that she co-signed on. And it's extremely troubling, and we are only seeing it becoming a bigger issue. And there's nothing I can do legally right now to get her out of that, which is what is so concerning for advocates on these calls. There's nothing to do here other than bankruptcy.
And I don't know if Melanie, Tamara, or Joe, you want to jump in here, but I also definitely have another question touching on that, Anna, that I'd love to jump to. So,
yeah, I just have one short comment, and that's what we've seen around these debt collection cases and how there needs to be protections, because often these debt collectors will target people without legal representation. And so there was a study done by the Center for Responsible Lending in California that 98% of people being dragged into court had no attorney. And in the cases where they did have an attorney, the case was dismissed 100% of the time. So that's really showing a disparity that if you can't get an attorney, you're kind of left on the hook. Well, if you can, your case will be dismissed.
Just to add, again, a little bit to what the panelists have said so far. I mean, again, the impacts of these sort of these private student loans and sort of the lack of recourse that borrowers and their families face with them is just, I mean, again, some of the stories that Anna and Carolina have shared are just infuriating. And again, when we think about what, the promise of higher education, like students are told, to focus on school and like that is their job. But then afterwards you find out all of these, you find out all of these pieces of your loan that, oh, actually this was my job as a young person to understand these pieces. But just really quickly on the private loan piece, I think also, one piece of this too is how it impacts particularly, students' career choices, right? I mean, I know different young folks with private student loans who had, all their intention was to enter into careers of public service, whether that's, working for city government or working for nonprofits on, the issues that drove them to, Columbia University or some of these schools in the first place. I have a specific friend in mind who is a housing advocate who, was driven to go to, Columbia specifically to help folks get connected with housing. But because of these private loans and because, again, of the lack of, programs to help him, pay these off, he's constantly, being pushed to move into careers and move into organizations and move into, corporate jobs that, don't fulfill, the reason that he wanted to go to school in the first place. And so again, I think we're also, there's so many, again, heartbreaking and infuriating stories to come out of particularly some of these private student loans. But I also think about the impact, especially now when we know that we need people in these organizations to help folks, find housing, to help folks, access food, to help all of these, wonderful missions that a lot of folks want to, put forward in their career. But when you have these loans behind you, suddenly you have to choose between, sort of this mission-driven work that you went to school for in the first place and, doing a job that, you didn't expect to be doing just simply because of these debts that you have no sort of recourse on sort of paying off. So just wanted to add that in there about students' career choices and how it's directly impacted by some of these loans.
I would say, I will not echo what everybody said. I think it's a very similar experience. My biggest, concern right now, especially with the private student loan debt and in general, is like, I'm very interested in starting to look at using the bankruptcy court to alleviate some of this debt. The problem is it still seems kind of murky to me what kind of results you might get out of the bankruptcy court. It's very hard to talk about it with clients because in this kind of desperation with a lot of my clients, no matter how careful I am about saying like, I really, we can't get our hopes up, or I don't want to make promises, they hear a promise very often. And so, yeah, I would like to experiment more and more with the bankruptcy court and see if we can get better rulings. I know in the Southern District of New York, there's a student loan mediation program that the chief judge has put into place, which doesn't exist in the Eastern District. But it does seem that even if you're not going to be able to look at full discharge of the loan, and again, the bar is pretty high, it does seem like there's an opportunity to negotiate balances. And that does seem to be a possibility. And, I'm going to hang my hopes on that for one of my clients because I don't see any other option.
And thanks, Joe. And I want to take something you're talking about with clients struggling with repayment on debt and circle back to, I think, something that both Anna and Carolina said on top when we talked about in the last panel is that in addition to, owing, servicers debt, we also should talk more about debt that student loan borrowers hold to higher education institutions. So I'd love if we could talk a little bit about transcript withholding as a collection tactic that's used by some schools and how these bills impact that practice, and also how the practice of transcript withholding really harms student loan borrowers. And so I might call on Melanie to start jumping because I know we're running.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about this. And again, I think it's huge that, this package of bills includes the transcript withholding piece, because this is really a hidden form of debt collection that has a tremendous impact on students, and particularly students in New York. And so if folks aren't really familiar with how transcript withholding works, so when students owe a particular debt to their institution, which you can rack up because say you have federal aid and you leave school at the wrong time, your aid can revert to a loan that you then therefore owe to your institution. You can also accrue these debts from things like library fees or parking fines on campus that you didn't pay. There's all sorts of ways that these sorts of debts specifically to colleges can accrue. And again, I think it's so crucial that New York take on this issue, because this isn't even in, again, the not guaranteed federal student loan cancellation we're talking about. There's a lot of ways that students who are facing these debts, won't benefit or won't benefit directly from the proposed cancellation that we're seeing now. And so I really became familiar with this transcript withholding issue when, working on a report on student homelessness in New York's college system. So I was going to different youth shelters across the 5 boroughs and speaking with young people, some who had entered into college, some who had entered and left, and spoke with them about how their own housing status and their housing insecurity, how that impacted their ability to complete college. And time again, during these focus groups, one of the things that came up was these transcripts that were being withheld. And we heard this again from a lot of the housing providers that work directly with some of these young people living in these youth shelters, is that for some of these students, they were entering into institutions, they got into college, and again, had to leave for a variety of reasons. For some of them, because they didn't have a place to stay anymore. I spoke with, queer youth who had to leave their home because it was no longer safe for them to stay at home. And, they had to leave school as a result. And then, now they have this hold on their account and they can't get access to their transcripts. So they don't get any access to the classes that they've already taken, the credits they've already accrued. And so then what happens is, if they try to re-enter into college, they finally get some stability and, are ready to re-enter into school, they're blocked from being able to re-enter until they pay off that debt, in its entirety. And, again, for students who, maybe, again, living in sort of transitory living environments and, they left, an aunt's house in New Jersey and now live in New York and are ready to transfer to a different institution, they're unable to get proof of the classes that they took and the credits that they've accrued because of these institutional debts. And, I think Senator Thomas on the first panel there was talking about how this really is, a COVID recovery issue, right? That, students may have had to leave school again due to living in a pandemic and all of the issues that have come with that. And, I think it's so true that this is really tied to our ability to recover as a state, especially for young folks, again, who rely on colleges as not only, their stepping stone to economic mobility and stability, but also, for students who, rely on their dorms as a reliable place to live, or rely on, meal plans or cafeteria vouchers to be able to eat. Colleges provide a lot more than just the courses for students, and increasingly for a lot of students who are enrolling in school. And so this issue is huge. And, again, just one more point on, how, again, this is tied to, recovery. I think one thing that I'm keeping an eye on is with the recent passage of the latest federal stimulus plan under President Biden, the Department of Education put together some guidance saying that, colleges can actually use money that's coming to them from the stimulus package to forgive some of these debts and allow students to receive their transcript again. And so again, I think there are all these signs and indications that show that, students not being able to access these transcripts are not only directly harming, themselves and their families and their children, but, it also holds us back as a state, especially when at a time when, industries are closing down and folks, need to go back to school to get, into a new career. So I know some of my colleagues here have also seen this issue. And so I'm just really glad that, we have, folks like Senator Thomas and Assemblymember Epstein who are ready to lead on this, because, only one other state in the country, California, has fully banned transcript withholding as a practice. And so I think, the time is now for New York to step up for some of these students who are impacted by this practice.
That's awesome. And I want also know Anna and Carolina might have some client experience to kind of add on to what you were just saying, Melanie, about transcript withholding.
Yeah, I can add quickly. Transcript withholding is a huge problem, but I just want to add it is one of the many tools that institutions use to collect on directly owed tuition and debts directly owed to the schools or the state. As Assemblymember Epstein pointed out, if you owe a debt to SUNY, the New York State Attorney General's office is actually going to sue you in Albany every single time, no matter where you live, which results in thousands of default judgments against New York students, who have these debts, and it's very problematic. I'll share one story that I think is really exemplary of why this is such a horrific issue at the state level. I'm representing a client now who unfortunately became very ill and had to withdraw from a SUNY school mid-semester because of his medical issues. And these medical issues left him permanently disabled, and he had to go on Social Security benefits. Now, fortunately, the federal government recognized this as a problem and discharged his federal student loans because of his total and permanent disability. So he no longer owes any federal student loans. The federal government has discharged those, and he's fine there. However, the state is still pursuing him for the tuition debt owed for that semester directly to SUNY. And they actually got a default judgment against him in Albany because he was too sick to appear in Albany to defend himself. And this is going to impact him for quite some time. These judgments last for up to 20 years. Sometimes they can be renewed for even longer. And it means that the state is going to be able to take any tax refunds he receives. So if he gets any kind of child tax credit and he gets that back in his tax refund, the state's going to take that. And it's really problematic when there's a process at the federal level to discharge those loans, but there's not at the state level. And that's very concerning. And I think that the state owed tuition debts, and I think that direct institution owed tuition debts are very concerning and something people need to pay attention to. So that's all I'll add there.
Can I just ask, you consider, I mean, in a situation like his, are you considering bankruptcy, Anna?
It is one tool that we could use, but there are other factors that implicate whether or not bankruptcy would be right for him.
Right.
So it's
there's a lot to look at with bankruptcy.
It's an extreme measure, and there should be some other way to resolve this, but unfortunately there isn't.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I was just going to make that note, like the only solution or tool that we have for these cases is bankruptcy, right? I'm working with a client, she's 21 years old. She owes enough tuition debt to her school that we cannot come up with the money. She can work for the next 5-10 years. She might not be able to save enough, right? Well, she's covering her cost of living. So for me to mention bankruptcy, her first response is, I have no idea what that is and what that involves. And my heart sunk, right? Like, how am I even mentioning this when it's a 21-year-old who is really academically excelling and really focused, but now this debt is really putting a halt. And I am afraid that oftentimes, or I want to say 99% of the time, this is our only solution because our clients cannot come up with the debt to satisfy it, and it always balloons, right? You're dealing with a debt collector, the interest is there. So this is something the state can actually do because this is a very state-focused issue. So I hope that we can move the needle in that area.
And with that, I know like for everyone who joined, we're a few minutes over, but I still really want to round this out. You all have been amazing panelists. I don't want the panel to end. There's so many more questions, but I would love to hear you all just kind of take a second, if you could, we can quickly go around. If everyone could give us something with like a call to action. So we've talked a lot about these issues. We talked a lot about these bills, but just kind of like a rounding out thoughts on this legislation and protecting borrowers. And so I'll stop there so you all can jump in.
Okay, I'll do it really quick. So I think my takeaway message, call to action, if you're an advocate watching this session, I want you to continue making noise. The fact that each of us can spend an entire day telling horror stories says a lot about this crisis. So I want you to continue making a push. And when I say make some noise, have conversations with legislators at the state level, at the federal level. Use your advocate powers to be able to, again, provide the protections that consumers need. If you're a student loan borrower, do the same thing. For way too long, this has been an issue that we've kept secret. Like, who wants to air out the fact that they owe thousands of dollars or that they have this debt, right? It is the time now. Your representatives need to hear from you in order to prioritize your needs. And so if nothing else, please review all the bills we have. If you can support them, I guarantee you, each bill addresses a unique situation, but together they are very powerful. And I wholeheartedly believe in New York and our legislature to really take the lead and start pushing back and protecting consumers.
And
I think, oh, sorry.
Oh, Tamara, you go. I was gonna start calling you a bit. Tamara, you can go, and then I was gonna call on Joe next.
I think for the debt collection bills in particular, they're really important because, as you've seen, the borrowers here are held to such an impossible standard and they're facing these devastating consequences. And the institutions that are going after these borrowers are never held accountable. They often can't even produce the right paperwork to keep their lawsuits going if there's an attorney representing the client. So just having these bills to actually hold the institutions to the same accountability standard as the borrowers and individuals themselves is really important.
And Joe, do you want to hop in here?
Sure. I guess one of the things I would say is just as advocates and as lawmakers or legislators who have the ability to influence on the state level what's happening to assist people with this, is to really just remember or to try and internalize, or to even try and just put yourself in the shoes, if you haven't been, although many people have been, of what it means to be somebody who really wants to address a debt and move forward with their life, and who simply can't because they cannot afford. There is no option. I do a lot of debt collection work, and I get cross-eyed views from judges all the time about my clients just trying to get out of a debt buyer, bill or something. But the reality is it's not true. The people I work with and all of my clients, they want to pay their bills. They want to address everything. They want to resolve everything. They want better lives. They want to move forward, and they want to be responsible. But when it comes to student debt, literally, there are very often no options. And we have got to make it possible for people to have options to move forward with their lives.
Thanks, Joe. And Anna, do you want to jump in, and Melanie, you can round us out?
Yeah, that's great. And I think everyone's done a really good job here of saying what needs to happen next. What I'll say is just that I think we really need to reframe the conversation about who is being impacted by the student debt crisis. It's not just young people who have lots of opportunity to get high-paying jobs, right? That's not what we're seeing. This crisis affects so many people across such a broad spectrum of our community. And we really need to take a look at that individually and see who's being affected. Is it just student loan debt? Is it tuition debt? Is it private student loan debt? What is happening here, so that we can really dive deep into a multiple of solutions that need to happen. This is not one size fits all. There needs to be a bigger, broader conversation about these things. And I'm happy to be part of the one that's happening today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, and I guess just to close things out here, I mean, again, we started off this conversation, thinking about what is the state's role here, and what does it matter in this moment of, us pushing for federal debt cancellation? What does state action matter? And again, for me, I think what I just keep coming back to is the fact that the state has, has a real responsibility for the borrowers that are in our state. Again, as I mentioned earlier on this call, part of the reasons why New Yorkers find themselves, New Yorkers with student loans find themselves in the situations that we've talked about today is because in the last recession, particularly, the state turned its back on students and began disinvesting in our robust financial aid programs. We started divesting in our institutions and ability to again provide those supportive services that actually allow students to complete. And so again, I really think it's, I'm so glad that I'm here with the folks on this panel today and the lawmakers who joined the first panel earlier. And I'm really, heartened to see folks see this as a state issue because it really is. There's a responsibility that our state has in addressing the student debt crisis that in part our state helped create. And there's a responsibility to, in this moment of recovery and figuring out where we go from here, there's a real moment to address this crisis at hand and make sure that, borrowers aren't just, left to the whim of decisions that are being made in DC, but that there's a robust infrastructure in place to make sure that all borrowers, whoever you owe your debt to, have some sort of recourse to, get on with their lives and pay these things off and do all the things that we've all been promised to do, just by going to college. And so, again, just in terms of a call to action, I really want to echo what Carolina said earlier. Your stories are really, really important. And, I think, again, a lot of us have shame about the debt that we have and feel like, we've made bad choices and that's why we're in the position that we're in. But hopefully for folks joining us today, we've made it clear that there are plenty of decisions that have been made in our local governments that, that mean that, no, it's not your fault. It's much deeper than that. And so I'll drop into the chat. We do have a story collection form on the Young Invincibles website to collect some stories on particularly the transcript withholding issue. So we can, help some of these lawmakers understand how this issue is impacting their districts. And we also have a sign-on letter to support ending this practice in New York. So I'll drop those in the chat. But again, looking forward to all of you and this fight to end student debt here in New York.
And those are amazing. Sorry, thank you, Melanie. And those are amazing closing words. So I will not add too much onto that other than thank you all so much. You all have been a phenomenal panel. And it was just amazing to hear all of you all share after our wonderful first panel. So many thanks to all of you all for participating today. And also many thanks to everyone who joined today to listen in and participate. I'm also going to let everyone know that this will be recorded. And so we'll have a copy of this recording after today's event. But thank you all so much. It's been a wonderful day to talk about all this. So thank you.
Thank you.